December 1941. The forests west of Moscow are buried under a sheet of white so deep it swallows the boots of exhausted men. The temperature has fallen to -30°C, and the wind slices across open fields with the precision of a knife. German soldiers of Army Group Center crouch in shallow, frozen trenches, their breath turning instantly to ice on their scarves. Rifles jam. Machine gun bolts refuse to move. Even the horses, thousands of them, stand motionless, crusted with frost, too weak to lift their heads. A radio operator inside a half-collapsed wooden hut warms his hands over a dying candle. The device crackles, spitting static, then delivers the sentence every man fears, spoken with a coldness that rivals the weather itself. Positions are to be held. No retreat authorized. Outside, an entire platoon listens in silence. They look toward the dark line of trees where Soviet ski battalions are said to be moving. They know they cannot shift, cannot regroup, cannot fall back to safer ground. The order is absolute. And as the night deepens, it becomes clear that this command, issued far from the front, will decide the fate of hundreds of thousands. The reasons behind that order were rooted in a much larger story. In the summer of 1940, the German military stood at what appeared to be the height of its power. France had fallen in a matter of weeks. The Low Countries had collapsed under armored thrusts so swift they shocked even German planners. Across Europe, the image of the Wehrmacht was that of a force that could not be stopped, a machine that combined speed, coordination, and ruthless precision. To many in Berlin, the map of the continent looked nearly complete. Only one objective remained: the destruction of the Soviet Union. Within Adolf Hitler's inner circle, the idea had taken root long before the war began. His worldview framed the East not as a political rival, but as a vast territory destined for German occupation, a place whose resources, farmland, and labor would fuel a new empire. By late 1940, after France's defeat, he believed the moment had come. The British were still fighting, but he considered them a minor issue compared to the ideological struggle he envisioned. He wanted a lightning strike into Soviet territory, one so overwhelming that the Red Army would collapse before winter. Hitler predicted the campaign would last no more than a few months. Thus, on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, began. 3 massive German army groups pushed across a front stretching more than 1,000 miles. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad. Army Group South drove into Ukraine and toward the Black Sea. And at the center, the most powerful formation of all, Army Group Center, struck towards Smolensk and ultimately Moscow. The opening days were catastrophic for the Soviets. Millions of Red Army soldiers were encircled or taken prisoner. Entire divisions crumbled under the speed and coordination of German armored units. Communications broke down. Equipment was abandoned. Towns and villages fell so quickly that German officers often found meals still warm on tables. To many in Berlin, the campaign already looked decided. Reports flowing back to Hitler reinforced his belief that the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. He dismissed warnings from his generals about the size of the country, the poor roads, and the strain on logistics. Instead, he pressed them to accelerate the advance. Fuel trucks were pushed beyond their limits. Supply columns stretched so far that some units were receiving shipments weeks late. But the momentum of the offensive created the illusion that these issues were temporary, irritants rather than warnings, yet beneath the surface fractures were emerging. The deeper the German forces drove into Soviet territory, the more fragile their position became. Roads that were merely difficult in summer turned nearly impassable in autumn rains. Tanks began to fail from overuse. Engines clogged with dust. Spare parts grew scarce. Horses, still essential for moving artillery and supplies, collapsed from exhaustion. By September, even as German spearheads reached the gates of Smolensk, Fuel shortages forced many units to halt for days at a time. Commanders begged for pauses to reorganize. Hitler refused. Despite these strains, the push toward Moscow continued. In October 1941, the Germans launched Operation Typhoon, the final drive to capture the Soviet capital. It was meant to be the blow that would end the campaign. But the weather turned at the worst possible moment. The first snows fell earlier than expected. Mud thickened across the plains. Tanks bogged down. Infantry advanced only by wading through knee-deep slush. The Red Army, though battered, was still fighting, and Soviet resistance stiffened with every mile dot by November. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, physically, mentally, and structurally. German soldiers lacked winter clothing. Many slept in holes carved into frozen ground. Weapons malfunctioned. Vehicles refused to start. And the supply situation, already strained, deteriorated completely as the cold hardened into winter. For the first time since 1939, the German war machine was no longer advancing. It was struggling simply to maintain its positions. This was the moment when Hitler faced a choice: permit tactical withdrawals to reorganize and survive the winter, or forbid any movement backward. No matter the risk, the decision he made would define the next chapter of the war. For the soldiers on the ground, Hitler's refusal to permit retreat transformed the Eastern Front from a battlefield into a slow-moving catastrophe. Men who had marched confidently through Lithuania and Belarus in June were now barely able to stand. Frostbite spread faster than rifle fire. Fingers turned black. Noses stiffened and fell away. Thousands were evacuated not because of wounds, but because the cold had eaten into their flesh. The order to hold your ground meant that entire units stayed in exposed positions for days, sometimes weeks, without proper shelter. They dug into frozen soil with bayonets and boot heels, carving out shallow trenches that offered little protection from the wind. Food was scarce. Bread froze into bricks. Potatoes became solid stones that could not be cut. Soldiers warmed small tins of meat over candles, eating in silence as snow drifted into their shelters. Letters home spoke not of victory, but of endurance. Shivering nights, frozen boots, and the sound of Soviet artillery echoing across the plains. Morale, once high, collapsed under the weight of exhaustion. The men knew that movement might save them, a withdrawal, even a few miles, but the order forbade it. They were bound to the ground by words spoken hundreds of kilometers away. This was the human cost of rigidity, paid before a single strategic consequence was felt. Tactically. The no-retreat order dismantled the very foundation of German operational doctrine. For years, the Wehrmacht had relied on maneuver, flexible withdrawals, rapid counterattacks, and calculated repositioning. Mobility was the essence of its success. But as Soviet forces attacked in December 1941, German units found their greatest strength neutralized. They could not pull back to better defensive ground. They could not shorten their lines. They could not regroup their formations to respond to new Soviet breakthroughs. The Red Army exploited this immobility with precision. Ski battalions slipped around static German positions, cutting communication lines and isolating forward companies. Artillery struck trenches that could not be abandoned. Soviet tank brigades probed flanks that German commanders begged to shorten. Every kilometer held became a liability rather than an asset. A regiment pinned in a forest line could not reinforce its neighbors. A division forced to stay near an exposed village became an easy target for encirclement. Generals knew what needed to be done, but Hitler's order left them with only one option: hold until destroyed. As one officer wrote in his diary, "Our doctrine is broken by our own command." What had once been a sophisticated war machine was now a collection of immobile targets. Waiting for the next blow to fall. Winter exposed the limits of German technology in ways few had anticipated. Tanks that outclassed their opponents in summer now refused to start. Oil thickened into jelly. Tracks froze in place overnight. Machine guns had to be warmed over small fires before they could be fired, revealing positions to Soviet patrols. Even the famous Mauser rifles jammed without warning as ice formed inside their bolts. The Wehrmacht had entered the Soviet Union expecting a short campaign, and because of that expectation, they carried almost no equipment designed for temperatures below freezing. Soviet forces, by contrast, operated with tools and machinery built for the environment. Their T-34 tanks moved across snowfields with wide tracks that distributed weight more effectively. Their weapons were simple, rugged, and resistant to cold. Their winter uniforms insulated far better than German wool coats. Every technological advantage Germany possessed in the summer evaporated in winter. The no-retreat order magnified these failures. A tank that could not be started could not be moved to a repair depot. Artillery that froze in place remained easy prey for Soviet bombers. Vehicles abandoned due to mechanical failure could not be recovered because movement was forbidden. Technology that once enabled German dominance now became dead iron. Scattered across the landscape, silent proof that inflexibility is fatal in war. Hitler's decision to override his generals reshaped the entire command structure of the Eastern Front. Before Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht's leadership had been defined by initiative. Field marshals and generals were trusted to make decisions based on conditions in real time. But as the winter crisis unfolded, that autonomy evaporated. Orders from the Wolfschanz grew increasingly rigid. Commanders who proposed tactical withdrawals were rebuked. Those who insisted on them were relieved of duty. Within weeks, the German High Command became a collection of silenced voices. Experienced officers like Guderian and von Bock found themselves arguing not for victory, but for the survival of their armies. Their reports were dismissed as pessimism. Their recommendations were treated as challenges to Hitler's authority. And as a result, strategic decision-making shifted from the front to a distant headquarters. Disconnected from the realities of frostbite, ammunition shortages, and collapsing lines, this created a command culture based not on expertise, but on obedience. The gap between battlefield reality and high-level decision-making widened with every day of winter. And into that gap, thousands of lives fell. These four angles capture only part of the disaster. Others, moral, psychological, and adversarial, deepened the consequences further. For the Red Army, Hitler's refusal to allow retreat created an opportunity unlike anything they had faced since June 1941. In the summer, German mobility had broken Soviet lines repeatedly. But in winter, with German divisions fixed to immovable positions, the dynamic shifted. Soviet commanders recognized that their enemy could no longer maneuver. And this realization changed the very nature of their offensive planning. Zhukov's staff studied reconnaissance reports showing German units clinging to villages, crossroads, and forest edges. These clusters of troops, once protected by their ability to redeploy, had become isolated islands in a sea of snow. The Soviets attacked these pockets from multiple directions, forcing the Germans to fight without depth, without reserves, and without escape routes. Where gaps appeared, Soviet ski troops filtered through, encircling strongpoints that, under normal conditions, would have been abandoned long before. The Red Army also learned to synchronize its movements with the weather. Storms and low temperatures grounded the Luftwaffe, reducing German aerial reconnaissance and relief flights. Meanwhile, Soviet infantry advanced with white camouflage, invisible against open fields until they were nearly upon German trenches. Every day that German units were forbidden to fall back gave the Soviets more room to exploit. Their confidence grew. Their commanders gained experience. And by early 1942, the Red Army, once on the brink of collapse, had discovered that Germany's greatest strength had turned into its greatest vulnerability. No military decision exists in a vacuum. And Hitler's no-retreat order reveals a profound moral failure at the heart of German wartime leadership. The order was not grounded in strategic logic. It was driven by ideology, by the belief that willpower alone could overcome reality. In Hitler's worldview, retreat equaled weakness. Flexibility equaled doubt. Human cost was irrelevant. Soldiers were instruments, not lives. This mindset inflicted consequences far beyond the battlefield. Commanders faced impossible choices: obey the order and sacrifice their men, or disobey and face dismissal, or worse. Many officers, though fully aware of the danger, felt bound by their oath of loyalty. Others believed that any setback risked unleashing political retaliation. The result was a culture in which moral responsibility dissolved into blind obedience. The suffering of ordinary soldiers was deepened by this ideological rigidity. A withdrawal could have saved tens of thousands from freezing to death. It could have prevented encirclements, preserved manpower, and stabilized the front. Instead, human endurance was gambled against weather, logistics, and Soviet momentum, all on the assumption that fanatical perseverance could alter the laws of nature. This angle exposes not only the flaw in Hitler's leadership, but also the broader tragedy of a military forced to obey commands that ignored both ethics and reality. Perhaps the most overlooked dimension of the no-retreat order was its psychological impact on the German command structure. The Wehrmacht had long prided itself on decentralized decision-making, where initiative and adaptability were valued. Winter 1941 shattered that tradition. Officers who once made rapid battlefield decisions now hesitated, fearing that any deviation, even if tactically sound, could end their careers. Fear spread through headquarters tents and command dugouts. The question was no longer, what is the correct military action? But what will Berlin approve? This shift eroded confidence. Divisional commanders stopped proposing bold maneuvers. Corps leaders softened reports to avoid seeming defeatist. Frontline officers carried the weight of knowing that logical decisions could be interpreted as insubordination. Soldiers felt this psychological paralysis as well. They sensed their leaders' uncertainty, and morale declined not just from the cold or hunger, but from the realization that survival depended on orders detached from reality. Hope, the intangible ingredient that sustains armies, faded into resignation. This mental deterioration set the conditions for the catastrophe that followed, where immobility and fear combined to create losses on a scale few armies could withstand. These angles collectively form the prism through which the winter disaster must be understood, a convergence that led directly into the turning point of the campaign. The Soviet counteroffensive that began in early December 1941 quickly transformed into a broad, sustained assault stretching from Kalinin in the north to Yelets in the south. Temperatures dropped so sharply that even experienced Siberian troops struggled, yet they advanced with determination. The Red Army sensed that the German line, once feared, once unstoppable, was brittle. And every day, the consequences of Hitler's no-retreat order became more visible. Northwest of Moscow, Soviet divisions struck the positions of the German Ninth Army. These units, already weakened by frostbite and ammunition shortages, attempted to realign their front. Their officers requested permission for a fallback of a few kilometers to a more defensible ridge. The answer arrived within hours from the Wolfschanze: hold, no movement backward. The Soviets attacked again the next morning. Entire companies were overrun before sunrise. Survivors withdrew on their own initiative, only to be reprimanded by headquarters. Their hesitation in obeying rigid orders invited not discipline, but destruction. Farther south, around Tula, the 2nd Panzer Army faced a similar crisis. Heinz Guderian had pushed his armored divisions deep into Soviet territory, but now they were immobilized by snow and lack of fuel. Soviet cavalry and ski units moved swiftly through forests, striking supply lines and isolating forward outposts. Guderian, perhaps the most vocal critic of static warfare, radioed Berlin repeatedly. He explained that his men were in open ground, exposed to sub-zero winds, and outflanked. His final message was blunt: a retreat is urgently necessary to avoid catastrophe. Hitler rejected it. The position was to be held. As the Soviets widened their assault, the German problem grew geometric. One village after another became a fixed point of resistance that could not shift, could not bend, could not adapt. The enemy flowed around these positions, cutting paths that separated battalions from regiments, regiments from divisions. Roads that had once served as arteries for rapid advance now became traps where ice-covered corpses marked the routes of failed attempts to resupply isolated units. In the forests outside Kaluga, a German infantry regiment held a line that had not been fortified. There was simply no time. The snow was waist-deep. Their machine guns froze at dawn. Soviet forces struck repeatedly, and each attack chipped away at the defenders. Under normal circumstances, the regiment would have withdrawn to the next ridge, reorganized, and counterattacked. But Hitler's order forbade even a measured retreat. After 3 days, the regiment was nearly gone. Out of more than 2,000 men, fewer than 300 could still fight. The rest were dead, frostbitten, or missing in the blizzard-swept woods. This was the daily rhythm across Army Group Center: shock, collapse, isolation, destruction. By mid-December, the Soviets had recaptured Klin and Istra. Their troops pushed toward the Volga River's upper reaches, threatening to cut off major elements of the German Fourth Army. The situation was so grave that Field Marshal von Kluge telephoned Berlin with an uncharacteristic plea. His army, he said, risked encirclement on a scale not seen since Napoleon's retreat of 1812. Hitler interrupted him. "You exaggerate the danger. There will be no withdrawal." It was a turning point not only on the battlefield, but in German command culture. Many officers realized that their supreme commander was no longer making decisions based on military logic. They felt trapped between professional responsibility and political fear. The front line reflected this tension. Units defending exposed salients began to crumble. Those on the flanks were pushed backward, not in organized retreats, but in desperate, unauthorized flights from positions that offered no hope of survival. The Soviets pressed harder, sensing a psychological break. Their artillery, often placed on sleds pulled by horses, moved with surprising speed. Mortar thumped through the night. The crack of sniper rifles echoed through forests. German troops, huddled in shallow trenches, endured conditions that few armies in modern history had survived. The cold was an enemy as relentless as the Red Army. Men froze sitting upright, rifles still in hand. Frostbite amputations overwhelmed field hospitals. The collapse was no longer theoretical. It was visible in the snow-covered bodies, the abandoned vehicles, the prisoner columns marching east. By the final week of December, one reality was clear: a catastrophe was unfolding, and the order that forbade retreat had shaped its every contour. Yet the worst was still ahead, for the coming month would reveal the full scale of destruction that immobility had caused. January 1942 opened with a front line that no longer resembled a cohesive military formation. German units were scattered across a jagged arc west of Moscow, some clinging to villages, others trapped in forests, many existing only on paper. The Soviet High Command saw the disintegration clearly and widened its offensives. What had begun as a counterattack to relieve pressure on Moscow now evolved into a broad, coordinated push designed to break the invader completely. One of the first major disasters unfolded around the town of Köln, where several thousand German soldiers found themselves surrounded by Soviet forces. Under normal circumstances, they would have withdrawn weeks earlier, but Hitler's order to hold every position left them stranded. Supplies had to be dropped from the air. Horses, their breath frozen into white plumes, pulled improvised sleds filled with ammunition across treacherous ground. The defenders endured constant attacks, dwindling food, and temperatures that turned steel as brittle as glass. Their ability to resist was grimly impressive. But their sacrifice underscored a grim reality. They were trapped not solely by the enemy, but by an order that forbade retreat. Even larger calamities unfolded across Army Group Center. The most devastating occurred during the Soviet Vyazma operations, where German divisions found themselves stretched thin along a front they could not shorten. Soviet breakthroughs created deep salients that carved the German line into disjointed fragments. Units that attempted to pull back were reprimanded. Those that stayed in place were overrun. By the end of January, entire regiments disappeared in the snowbound forests east of Smolensk, their survivors stumbling westward in small groups. Frostbitten and half-starved, the numbers began to reflect the scale of the catastrophe. German casualties, killed, wounded, frostbitten, or missing, surged past 300,000. The losses exceeded those suffered in the entire campaign up to that point. They were not the result of a single battle or encirclement, but the cumulative effect of countless positions held too long. Countless opportunities for withdrawal denied in the southern sectors. Where Guderian had commanded, the collapse was equally severe. His panzer formations, once symbols of German speed and power, were now skeletal. Engines failed in the freezing cold. Fuel convoys vanished into snowdrifts or fell to Soviet ambushes. Tanks became immobile bunkers, forced to fire from fixed locations. Infantry regiments marched through knee-deep snow toward positions they knew they could not hold. When Guderian finally attempted limited withdrawals to save his men, he was removed from command on Hitler's orders. His dismissal sent a message to every officer on the front. Survival was secondary to obedience. Meanwhile, the Soviets exploited every weakness. Their cavalry swept through forests and frozen marshes, striking supply routes with precision. Their infantry advanced relentlessly, fortified by the knowledge that their enemy could not maneuver. Their tanks, particularly the T-34, proved reliable in winter conditions where German machines failed. Soviet commanders understood that the Germans were trapped not by encirclement alone, but by command paralysis. By late January, the German High Command attempted to reassert control. Reinforcements trickled in from the west, but they were few and often unequipped for winter war. Hitler issued additional orders emphasizing steadfast defense, insisting that the crisis could be reversed through determination. He relieved commanders he deemed insufficiently loyal or aggressive. But none of these actions addressed the core problem. The German front had been stretched beyond its limits. Its forces shattered by winter, and its flexibility destroyed by rigid instruction. In some areas, German troops fought with extraordinary resilience. Small groups held isolated farmhouses for days, repelling wave after wave of Soviet infantry. Others conducted night raids to recover food or ammunition. Their endurance prevented a total collapse. But these acts of bravery took place within a strategic framework that no longer made sense. Valor could not substitute for mobility. Determination could not overcome the freezing cold. Heroism could not replace fuel, clothing, or competent strategic leadership. By February 1942, Soviet forces had pushed the Germans back between 100 and 250 kilometers across various sectors. The threat of a complete German retreat from central Russia loomed. Army Group Center, once the spearhead of Barbarossa, now resembled a fragmented organism, clinging desperately to life. The no-retreat order had achieved none of Hitler's intended outcomes. It had not stabilized the line. It had not preserved combat strength. It had not deterred the Soviets. Instead, it had accelerated losses, crippled mobility, and shattered morale. And as the winter crisis finally began to ease with the coming of spring, the German army emerged altered, exhausted, reduced. and psychologically shaken. This devastation set the stage for the broader consequences that would shape the rest of the war. When the Soviet winter offensive finally slowed in March 1942, the landscape that emerged revealed the scale of the German disaster. What had once been the spearhead of the largest invasion in history was now a battered, hollowed-out force barely capable of holding the line. Entire divisions existed only as names on a roster. Battalions that had marched into Russia with 1,000 men could now field fewer than 200. Frostbite cases rivaled the number of battlefield wounds. Medical units, overwhelmed for months, reported amputations at levels unseen in modern warfare. The German High Command faced a painful truth: their army had survived the winter only in fragments. The casualty lists from Army Group Center alone exceeded 300,000 men, losses which could not be replaced quickly, if at all. Many of the dead were not killed in combat, but perished from exposure, starvation, and exhaustion. They died holding positions that offered no tactical advantage, their lives spent on ground that should have been abandoned long before. Strategically, the consequences were profound. The Wehrmacht had entered the Soviet Union as a force defined by momentum. Its strength lay in speed, concentrated firepower, and the ability to overwhelm opponents before they could reorganize. But the winter of 1941-1942 shattered that rhythm. The army that emerged no longer possessed the energy or initiative that had driven it across Europe. It was now fighting a defensive war on a vast front against an enemy that had regained both confidence and capability. The Soviet Union, once thought defeated, had proven resilient. The winter victories strengthened its morale and reshaped its military doctrine. Soviet commanders saw that the Red Army could not only resist the Germans, but push them back under the right conditions. Reinforcements continued to arrive from the east. Armament factories relocated beyond the Urals increased production. The psychological shift was unmistakable. The fear that had gripped the Soviet people in 1941 was replaced by a fierce determination to fight. No matter the cost. German commanders recognized the turning point. Field Marshal von Kluge described the winter as a catastrophe born not of enemy strength alone, but of our own decisions. Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, wrote in his diary that the rigid orders deprived the army of its most essential weapon: freedom of action. Officers who had survived the winter felt haunted by the memory of positions held too long and men lost to decisions they were forbidden to challenge. Morale across the German ranks had permanently shifted. Soldiers no longer believed that their leadership understood the realities of the front. They followed orders, but without the confidence that had once fueled the Wehrmacht's success. Quiet conversations in trenches and dugouts centered on the winter, why they had not been allowed to maneuver, why withdrawals were forbidden, why so many had died needlessly. Though discipline remained firm, the sense of invincibility, the psychological edge that had carried the Germans through early victories, was gone. The material impact was equally severe. Tens of thousands of vehicles had been lost to cold and overuse. Horses, essential for transport, died by the thousands. Ammunition levels were dangerously low in several sectors. Even with the front stabilizing, the Germans were forced to divert precious resources from other theaters to rebuild the battered Eastern armies. This slow recovery delayed future operations and limited the Wehrmacht's strategic choices for the coming year. More importantly, the winter crisis cemented a destructive pattern in German command culture. Hitler emerged from the disaster convinced that his refusal to allow retreat had prevented a total collapse. He interpreted survival as proof of the correctness of his leadership. This belief would shape every major decision he made thereafter, with consequences that would echo across Stalingrad, Kursk, and the final defense of Berlin. The aftershocks of the no retreat order were felt far beyond the winter of 1942. They shaped strategies, personalities, and the entire trajectory of the war. AR is often remembered through battles, victories, or sweeping movements across maps. But sometimes history turns on something quieter, a single decision, spoken far from the front, that reshapes the fate of armies and nations. Hitler's no-retreat order was such a decision. It did not carry the noise of artillery or the movement of armored divisions. It carried something far heavier, the refusal to accept reality. The winter of 1941-1942 revealed what happens when ideology overtakes judgment. The German army had marched into the Soviet Union with confidence built on years of rapid victory. Yet the moment conditions demanded humility and adaptation, its leadership chose rigidity. That choice destroyed more than 300,000 soldiers. It fractured trust between commanders and their men. It transformed a mobile, flexible military into a static organism bound by political will rather than military logic. For the men in the snow, the infantryman holding a frozen rifle, the officer pleading for permission to maneuver, the medic tending to frostbitten hands, the consequences were not theoretical. They were lived one freezing night at a time. And their suffering became a lesson written into the history of warfare. No army, no matter how strong, can survive when its leadership denies the conditions it faces. The Soviets emerged from that winter not only with regained territory, but with renewed belief in their strength. The Germans emerged diminished, their aura of invincibility shattered. That shift in momentum would echo through Stalingrad, Kursk, and the final battles in Berlin. Looking back, the tragedy of the no-retreat order is not only the scale of the losses, but their inevitability once the command was given. It showed that war punishes inflexibility. It showed that leadership without listening is a path to ruin. And it showed that sometimes survival depends not on holding ground, but on knowing when to let it go. The snow eventually melted. The front lines moved again. But the consequences of that winter remained. A reminder that even in the largest war in history, a single command can change everything.